is. Look in your Bibles in Ephesians chapter 5 as we continue our series on Fight for Your Marriage. Ephesians chapter 5. We're going to look at those familiar words we've looked at. We're going to break some of those down and see Ephesians chapter 5. I want to start off today, though, by telling you about one of the most important marriages in all of history. You probably haven't even heard of this marriage, but it's the marriage between Martin Luther and Catherine von Bora. Luther, as you know, was famous for starting the Great Reformation, which put the Bible at the center of what God wants us to do, not the church. And he rebelled against the Catholic Church, and they protested, and that's why we have Protestantism today. But one of the areas that he took issue with was the teaching that all clergy, all ministers, all monks, nuns, they had to be celibate. Couldn't be married. No sexual relationship. And here's what he said. That's not in the Bible. And so he told that, and he wrote a book on that called Monastic Vows, and he proved and forced celibacy on the priest was just an invention of man. And so here's what happened. He ended the book by encouraging all of the nuns all over Germany and even the world to throw off their monastic vows and go find a husband. And so one convent picked up on this. There was 12 nuns who lived there, and they decided that's what we're going to do. We were going to get rid of all this monastic stuff, and we're going to go find a husband. Except the Catholic Church wouldn't let them out. They locked them in the convent. And so here's what Martin Luther did. He planned this great heist, and he got those 12 ladies out there in 12 big, huge fish barrels and took them out by night. And here's what he did. One by one, he found a husband for them. Except for one lady. They couldn't find a husband. She was not very attractive. She was very forceful, very much free-willer and did what she wanted to do. And so Catherine von Bora was the lady. And here's what she said. She came up to Luther. She said, "You got me into this mess. You're either going to have to find me a husband or you're going to have to marry me yourself." Luther was 40 years old. He was a 40-year-old virgin, had never had any relationship with a woman. He was quite content in his singleness, and he didn't want to marry her. And so he said no. And she bore him down over and over and over until he finally said, "Okay, I'll marry you." And somebody asked Luther this one time, "Why did you marry her?" And he responded simply this, "To spite the devil." Now that's the least romantic reason ever for a wedding in history of mankind, just to spite the devil. That's why I married her. So the marriage didn't start off as you think about like a fairy tale, but they end up having one of the most incredible marriages in all of history. We know most of about their marriage from their letters. He would write to her and she would write back. She was really smart and pretty fiery and quick-witted, but they were passionately in love. His favorite titles for her when he would write to her would be something like this: Lord Katie, or Dear Rib, my rib, or my Empress, my true love, my dear gift of God. That's how he would write to her. Now, husbands, later, send your wife a text like that. If some of you can text, send your wife a text and say, "Dear Rib," and see what happens to you. You probably get hit in the ribs later. But toward the end of his life, he began to, and early in his life, he treated marriage as something primarily that was just functional. He said God designed marriage for one reason, and that's to stave off sexual temptation. But at the end of his life, he would call Katie von Bora, quote, "the greatest earthly gift of grace that a man could ever have." They loved each other. She was more than his lover. She was his confidant, his companion, his best friend. Now, friendship is one of the most forgotten elements of marriage. Many of you probably realize your spouse is supposed to be your friend, but do you really see attraction and passion and romance at the core of marriage? And that's what we're taught when we're teenagers and when we're in our 20s. It's passion and romance. That's the core of marriage. If anything, you see marriage primarily as romance spiced with a little friendship. But really, marriage is friendship spiced with a little romance. If you want a marriage to be endearing and enduring, friendship has to be the core basis of it. Sociologist John Gottman did an experiment with couples. And he asked them the one determining factor that makes them satisfied with romance, sex, and intimacy. 70% of the wives said it was the quality of the couple's friendship. It's our friendship. That's what satisfies me. Guess what the percentage of men were? Same. 70%. 70% of men, 70% of women in marriage say friendship is what holds our marriage, our intimacy together. And then he finished his little looking at all this by saying this phrase: men and women really do come from the same planet after all. Proverbs 2:17 calls your spouse a companion. The Hebrew word is a strange word. It's al-loop. Al-loop. It's a unique word that lexicons translate as a special confidant or a best friend. And in the greatest romantic book of all in the Bible, the Song of Solomon, the bride says of her groom this: "This is my lover. This is my friend." Ephesians chapter 5. Paul is writing to the church at Ephesus. Look what he says in verse 21. Verse 21. I know it's a sentence out of the little context, but I want you to see this first. Submitting to one another in the fear of God. We, all of us, are to submit to one another. Then he goes into verse 22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands love those verses, but they don't like verse 25 as much. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. How did he do that? Death. Till the death. That he might sanctify and cleanse her with a washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Verse 33, nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. He doesn't use the word friendship there. But when you think about it, there are a couple of things in this passage that teach you marriage is essentially friendship. Here's the first thing I want you to see. Friendship equals oneness. Friendship equals oneness. He uses the analogy of the body. It pervades the passage. The body, the body, the body. In one sense, we can think of our bodies as separate from us. In another sense, we can't. I am one with my body. My wife is, in one sense, separate from me, and yet she is one with me. Listen, it didn't magically happen at the altar in a church where we got married. It didn't magically happen that, now they're one. God himself does it. That's how it happens. Every marriage. That's how marriage is designed. And so when marriages are torn apart, there's issues because part of your oneness is gone. So God himself puts us together. God fused Jennifer and my life together. Our homes, our futures, most of life we will experience together. We are two separate beings united into one, as the verse says, and the two shall become one flesh. That's the essence of marriage, becoming one. In fact, when Adam saw Eve in the garden, he said, this is bone of my bones, this is flesh of my flesh. She looks like me. He's been naming all these animals, the giraffe, the hippopotamus, and the snakes, and all those things. And he finally says, oh, she looks like me. She is bone of my bones. She is flesh of my flesh. I can see part of who I am. He didn't say, wow, what a hot babe, I can't wait to get to know her. He said, I see part of my own soul there. I see part of my own body there. That's what a friend is. Someone who feels and shares your deepest interests and passions. Secondly, friendship equals a common cause. Friendship equals a common cause. There's a progression in this passage toward a common cause. What's that common cause in this Ephesians passage? It's not just marriage. It's what every Christian should be doing. It's Christ-likeness. Moving toward being like Christ. 1 John 3:2 says this, "Dear friends, we know that when Christ appears, we'll be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. And all who have this hope in Him purify themselves just as He is pure." This is our greatest passion. This is preparing to see Jesus. Do you know what that's what your life is? You are preparing your life to see Jesus. And Jennifer and I are assigned to one another to help each other along the way. That's what a spouse does. Maybe God's plan doesn't make sense to you. Wives, submit to your husbands as you would to Christ. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loves the church. The reality is that makes a lot of sense if you're a believer. The world doesn't understand that. The world doesn't get the submission and the loving thing. The world doesn't get that. But if you're a believer, you understand that. Christ is in two people who He joins together and gives them a unique role to fulfill. What makes a friendship great is a sense of unity in a common cause. If you don't have a common cause, you're not unified. But you know what we've done? We have confused the word friendship today. Social media has redefined it for us. Now a friend is someone that you don't have to communicate verbally with. You don't ever have to say a word to them. You know them by a sentence or two that they post this week about their life. And then you feel obligated to like it. Sadly, many people are going to get married in the coming years and they have no friendship with their mate because they are confused about what the word friend means. Now, friendship or a common cause can be found in and around a lot of things. If someone else and I share a common love for a sport or a hobby or a favorite author, we can find friendship around that. I have friends like that in my life, and you do too. But the deeper the shared interest, the greater the friendship. And so for a Christian, the deepest passion is seeing Jesus, is growing in Jesus, is being like Jesus. Christian marriage is supposed to be a comrade in your greatest passion and a companion for the greatest journey. It is your commitment to your spouse's holiness to keep the marriage going because it's friendship at the deepest level. It's not just a surface friendship. It's the deepest kind there possibly can be. You ever hear the proverbial story about Michelangelo who was asked how he could carve a magnificent statue like of a horse out of stone? And here's what he said. I just see the horse in the stone and chip away everything that's not in the horse. I just see it there. Now start chipping away everything that's not the horse. That's what marriage is. You see the radiant beauty of Christ-likeness in your spouse, and you wash and you chip away everything that's not there. That's not that. There are sparks that fly in marriage. Now, sometimes they're different than the ones that fly in dating, but they're still good sparks. You're chipping away. Look at verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself for her, that He might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the Word, that He might present her to Himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as the Lord does the church. What's he saying? Husbands, you are to love your wife like Christ loves this church and all the churches. That's why the Bible calls the church, the Christians, the bride of Christ. Do you love your bride as much as the day you married? her, gentlemen. I'm under the belief that you should love her more and more and more. He says we are to get that, our wife, get that bride, and what are we to do to her? We are to sanctify her. What's that mean? That's what he did to the church. He sets us apart. You are setting your wife apart as something that is holy, something that is sacred, something that is above everything else in your life. You have put her there. And you want to do everything to make her holy and pure. And you wash her, not physically, he's not talking about that, but you help cleanse her. You are the spiritual leader of the home. You are to help her to grow spiritually. Let me tell you, I think, and I am a man, but I think it's harder for men to love their wives as Christ loved the church than it is for wives to submit to their husbands. I've never been a woman, don't ever plan on being a woman, so I'm not going to submit to a husband. But I think it's harder in the second analogy. Because Christ loves you and me, the church, so much that what did he do? He died for us. He gave up his life for us. So let's stop here for a minute and ask, what makes for a friendship? What makes for a great friendship? Well, first of all, there's a common cause. And we've already talked about that a little bit. But if you don't share a common cause, the friendship will never last. You'll get bored with each other. You'll being into each other can only take you so far. What's your common cause as a husband and wife? Here's what it should be. You ready? It's simple. Jesus. Jesus. That's why I've talked about in the last few weeks, don't marry a non-believer. If you do, you don't have this common cause. Night and day, it's different. Jesus is your common cause. Secondly, constancy. Constancy. A friend is someone you know will never leave because they're as committed to you as they are to themselves. You're like a part of their body. Proverbs 17:17 says this, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is made for adversity. So a friend is someone, has said this, is someone who walks in when everyone else walks out. A friend is somebody who walks into your life when everybody else abandons you. Got a friend like that? I hope you do, and I hope your spouse is like that. Your spouse should know that while you get upset with them, you're not going anywhere. You're not threatening to leave. You're the one who believes the best about them and give them the benefit of the doubt, because here's the thing, someone is not going to let you in until they know you're not going to reject them, to walk away or to humiliate them or expose their weakness. Jennifer told me this one time, if you ever leave, I'm going with you. I'm going with you. Our marriage is so important. You know, it kills me to hear spouses tearing their spouses down. Because I know that there's no way their spouse will ever open up to them. How could they? They don't feel safe with them. There's this constancy. Next, there's this transparency. There's this transparency. In order to have a friendship, you've got to open yourself up. Share what's going on emotionally. A companion who is like your own body has to see what's really going on and who you are. Some of you men are a closed book to your spouse. That's why she's not your friend. You closed her out emotionally. Oh, you talk, but you've closed her out emotionally. Now, here's what guys will do. They'll talk to one of the guys about anything and everything and then close their wife out, and it's going to damage your marriage. For some of you men, there's a simple activity I heard about that can transform your marriage. Come home, tell your wife one thing that happened that day, and then how you, keyword, felt about it. That's a foreign word to guys. This is how I feel about it. It may be a small step, but it would be a huge one in a way, would go a long way in uniting you in your friendship. You see, transparency will allow them to call out your sin. Believe me, they already see your sin. Proverbs 9:8 says this, reprove a wise man and he will love you for it, but fools despise wisdom and correction. Next one, trust. Trust. My body generally speaking, knows it is safe with me. Now, I may be unhappy with some part of my body, but my body knows I can trust Craig. Think about this for a second. Trimming your fingernails. You ever had somebody else do it? It's kind of weird. When I was in the Philippines, they absolutely wore me out until there was a lady who would come around, and it was an honor to cut pastors' fingernails. You ever heard of that? And so I said, no, I don't want anybody cutting my fingernails. I don't want to do all that. But they insisted, and so finally I did. It's kind of scary. Now, my body lets Craig do it because my body knows that if Craig feels pain, Craig's going to stop. But sometimes when Craig does cause the body pain, it's for the body's good. He knows. I know. I trust Craig for the most part. Do you know one of the most difficult things to restore in a marriage is trust? Trust. If your spouse has misused your trust, it's very, very difficult. Once you break it, it's almost seemingly impossible without the grace of God to fix it. And so trust requires good intentions. You must know your spouse has good intentions and the best for you when they start to cut your spiritual fingernails, if I can use that analogy. Look at verse 27. That he, Christ, might present her to himself a glorious church. And he's talking about the husband as well. Not having a spot or a wrinkle or any such thing, that she should be holy and without blemish. He's saying, husbands, that's what you're supposed to do to your wife. You are to set her apart, not having spot or wrinkle for her, or any such thing, that she should be holy and without blemish. That's what we are to do. There's some better ways of showing that than being harsh and cruel to your spouse. Simple thing here. For every one negative comment, there should be 5 positive. For every one negative comment you say to your spouse, there probably should be 5 positive. This is a big mistake fathers make with their children, bosses make with their employees, teachers make with their students, and wives and husbands with each other. We tend to only point out the weaknesses. And so when people feel like you are down on them, they really won't listen to you. If you're always negative all the time to them, they're not going to listen to you. Do you like to have negative people in your life? I don't. There used to be a negative person in my life. It was always negative. Everything was negative. And I can't stand it. They're not in my life anymore. But we don't like that negativity. So once you realize your spouse knows that you're their biggest fan, they'll often take your criticisms more to heart because they know it comes from somebody who really cares. And in all relationships, especially marriage, we tend to assume the positives and notice the weaknesses. But we should assume the weaknesses and notice the positives. For example, you married a sinner. That shouldn't be a surprise to you. When they sin, it shouldn't be a surprise to you. I mean, look at him. He's a sinner. Look at her. She's a rebel. You chose to marry this person. You married a sinner. So don't be surprised when they mess up because they're a sinner. Assume the positive about them. So instead of berating them over their sinfulness, speak blessing and empowerment over their lives. If not, without the grace of God, you might kill them. So see the beautiful creation at work inside of them and call it out for them. For every one word of criticism, speak 5 words of affirmation. So here's the core of marriage is friendship, and here's the application, and we're finished. If you're not married, prioritize friendship in your dating. If you're not married, prioritize friendship in your dating. If you're single, what are you looking most for in a spouse? It's kind of a stereotype that men overvalue looks in a mate and women overvalue earning potential. But neither of those things make for an enduring marriage. I don't know if you've noticed this or not, if you've been married for 30, 25, 30, 40, 50 years. Beauty fades. You will lose your sexual appeal. Your physical beauty over time will go away. And in the end, most of us kind of end up looking like each other in the first place. Earning potential may not work out. If you're trying to marry a rich guy, it's probably not going to work out. Even if you do get those things, neither makes for a really fulfilling relationship. What Adam needed in the garden was not just a sexual partner, he needed a companion, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, someone who is there with me. So marriage, again, is not romance spiced with friendship, but friendship spiced with romance. None of that stuff that you're looking for and all that surface stuff doesn't last in a relationship. As a matter of fact, psychologists say that infatuation lasts at its longest about 18 months, and then it's gone. Guess what the average marriage divorce rate is? Pretty close to 18 months. They say stuff like this: he's not who I thought he was. She's not what I thought she was going to be. And so they walk away. A lot of marriages are bad because people have gotten through the infatuation stage and now they're bored. They've gotten the idea from books and television and the movies that if you just find the person with whom you had the perfect chemistry, if the infatuation is strong enough, it could last forever. Love will keep us together. It didn't do it for Captain and Tennille, and it won't do it for you. It's going to take more than that. It never does. If you didn't prioritize friendship in the dating process and you haven't developed the friendship after the marriage started, your marriage could be in trouble. Secondly, if you're married, prioritize friendship in the marriage. Just prioritize it. Begin to prioritize it. Nothing can replace the centrality of friendship in your marriage. If you don't do that, if you don't prioritize the friendship, the relationship will slowly die. Your career can't replace your priority of your friendship with your spouse. Again, your love, your commitment to your kids cannot replace the priority of your friendship with your spouse, though that's what often happens. The center of the home is not parent and child. Some of you need to hear me on this. The center of your home is not parent and child. It's husband and wife. God, if He had wanted it to be that way, would have put a parent-child in the garden. He didn't. He put a husband and a wife. And so, in order for my home to be solid, my relationship with my wife has to be strong, and the greatest love I can give to my kids is to prioritize my wife over them. By the way, the Bible says in Ephesians 6:4, raise up your kids. You know what that means, don't you? Get rid of them. That's what it means. Raise up your kids. Get rid of them. The word we use is rear. Rear your kids. That image is interesting. Get behind them and start pushing them to independence. Sometimes you have to kick them in the rear to get them to independence. Rear your children. Get them out. Move them to independence. That's what you're called to do. That was just a bonus. We have to prioritize friendship above all things in our marriage. Listen, marriage has an unparalleled power over your life. You have tied your life to another person. Paul says, Jesus says, Moses said, all three, you have become one body. And because marriage has this unparalleled power in our lives, it has to have an unparalleled priority. You don't give it priority, you're going to lose the power in your marriage. So if your marriage is strong, then even if the rest of your life falls apart, you can usually make it. I've heard it said that there are three kinds of married relationships. There's back-to-back marriage. That's couples who have turned their back on each other. They live together, but they're separate. Maybe even in the same house, but they're just roommates. They're just sharing the bills. Then there's couples who are side-by-side couples. They work together on the house, the kids, some business, serving the church. They're together. But then there's this third group called face-to-face. That's the kind of relationship in one which, in addition to shoulder, side-by-side, they get a lot of face time drawing each other out in conversation, friendship, and intimacy. And maybe we need to work on that area. We need, as we talked about communication a few weeks ago, it's simple communication to help in your relationship. Now, I know women do this more naturally. They talk and communicate more naturally. They engage about their feelings. Women can sit and stare at each other for hours, pouring out their feelings to each other. I don't do that naturally. I'm reminded of Brian Reagan, who's a comedian, his story he told, and his wife asked him after he gets home from playing golf with a friend who'd just broken up with his girlfriend, and she asked him, well, how is he? And Brian says, well, I guess he's fine. And she says, well, is he dating anybody? He said, well, I don't know that. She said, how could you play golf with this guy for 3 hours and not come up with that answer? He said, well, how would I come up with that? Hey, that's a good putt. You dating anybody? And that's what women expect guys to do, and guys just don't do that. Guys don't do that. So something maybe we need to work on in communication. A simple exercise. Tell your spouse at the end of the day something that happened to you and how you felt about it. Now, you might see now that you made a mistake and you didn't prioritize friendship in the dating process. Maybe you were infatuated with her looks or his earning potential. And you say now, my spouse is not my best friend or my friend. Well, you have a lot more in common than you realize. You share a home. You share kids. If you're Christians, you share your greatest passion again. Leaving that spouse because you feel mismatched is not a biblical option. You're going to have to work at whatever friendship you can and trust God, and you'll probably find that the results are better than you expected. God, even in marriage, continually pours out His grace, doesn't He? In marriage. Now let me give you a warning. Be careful who you share your friendship with inside of marriage. Be careful who you share your friendship with inside of marriage. Beware of trying to have friends of the opposite sex who are not your spouse. When you're married, you shouldn't have a lot of close friends from the opposite sex. It's only asking for trouble. I didn't say you couldn't have friends of the opposite sex. I said you shouldn't have a lot of close friends that way. Many of you men share more of your problems with a girl at work because she'll listen to you and it leads to more problems. Or a woman finds a guy who really listens to me. An emotional adultery is having a friend of the opposite gender who is more of a friend to you than your spouse is. Now, why do people do that? Now, there are a lot of Christians who commit emotional adultery, not sexual adultery, but emotional adultery. And it's easy. Here's how they do it. Here's why they do it. Because they don't have to go through all the pain of someone who knows all the junk in their life. It's just a passing, fleeting infatuation. I once heard about a guy who had a close female friend, served as his best man in his wedding. Now, I don't want to be a judge, but girls, if a guy suggests that in your wedding, I suggest you reconsider the groom as well as the best man. Friendship is one of the most crucial but most overlooked dimensions of marriage. I hope you realize that the pattern and the power for all this is Jesus. It's Jesus. You see, I don't know if you realize or not, but you are in a love triangle. Not the kind the world talks about. But Jesus is at the top, and He's flowing into you. Love, and commitment, and dedication, and friendship, and grace, and kindness, and gentleness, and self-control, down to the bride, down to the groom, the other part of the triangle. It's all flowing as it should. That's what it is. Jesus is your friend. When He's your friend, it's easier to have a Christ-like friend who's your spouse. Maybe the reason you struggle in your marriage so much is you're not connected to the source. The foundation is not strong. Very first question I ask people who come to me for marital problems: how is your personal relationship with Jesus Christ? The answer to that question answers a lot of other questions. How is your personal relationship with Christ? Not your spiritual relationship with your spouse, your own personal relationship with Christ. If you don't have that, you're probably not going to have one with your spouse in the spiritual sense as well. But if you reconnect with God, it will fix your marriage more than any sermon, more than any seminar can ever do. Listen, your marriage and my marriage is right now as strong as we choose for it to be. I can make it better, or I can make it worse. My choices can lead to good consequences or bad consequences. So right now, your marriage, my marriage, we've got it on some level. Maybe it's here, wherever it is. It's right where you want it to be. It's as good as you want it to be. But it can get better. It can get better when you have that powerful relationship with Christ. Let me tell you this. Fight for your friendship and your marriage. It will bring huge results.